Hi, everybody. How's everyone doing after lunch? I know, it takes a second, right? Get warmed back up. I'm so excited to be back on the stage this year, and this is my personal favorite session, and I'm so honored to be joined on the stage with three incredible women who you'll hear from in a second. This year's theme of the conference, if you haven't picked up on it yet, is data as a product, and I think it's super timely. We picked this theme about a year ago, and I don't think we could have timed this up any better. We're talking about productizing and productization of data and AI a lot. We heard from Cassie this morning that the user experience is drastically changing. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think there are so many cultural, organizational, and technical challenges to doing this appropriately. So with that, we're going to jump into the conversation. And I'm going to have each of you do a quick background and introduction of yourselves. We'll start with Polly.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Polly Allen. Until November of 2022, last year, I was a principal product manager technical at Alexa AI. And I led the team that launched the first generative AI answers on Alexa back in 2020. I left big tech in the fall of November, really frustrated with the lack of diversity in leadership in AI, and really a lot of the problems Cassie was mentioning this morning, where there's a frustration from the part of technologists that business people don't have the depth to really be effective partners and understand them to be able to bring initiatives forward. And this frustration from the business side that they don't know how to get started learning how to get that depth unless they go back to school to do a master's degree or a computer science degree, coding boot camp. So AI Career Boost provides training programs for experienced business leaders who want to learn how to effectively lead and succeed in AI programs and projects. We launched in November, and it's been a really exciting journey so far.
Amazing.
My name is Wendy Batchelder. I am a partial Ohio native, I think, having graduated from Miami University. So I'm happy to be back here in Ohio with you today.
We'll claim you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thanks for making me feel like I belong. I currently work at Salesforce where I'm the Chief Data Officer, and I have responsibility for all data management. I've been at Salesforce about 18 months or so, and have really moved up throughout my career in the data space, just dealing with progressive data transformations. And the great thing about that is there's always more to do. So my husband and I have been married 15 years. We have 6 kids, which almost warrants its own data governance program. So that's an experience for another day, but that's me. I'm really glad to be here with you today.
Great. I'm Jen Tedrow. I am an executive director with Pathfinder product. And I've spent my career as a product manager, and I started really in more customer-facing roles, really trying to understand customer problems, moved into a business analyst role, and then there was this new thing called product management coming onto the scene. So for the past 12 years, I've been building a career in product management, and I've spent a lot of that time in very data-heavy roles, managing data products, and with my time with Pathfinder, we work with a lot of great different clients, just helping them realize value through product management principles. And most recently, I had the fun of helping a Fortune 50 company implement a data mesh from scratch. So had a lot of direct experience with treating data as a product. So super excited to share some of my insights from that, learn from these amazing women, and discuss this really intriguing topic with you guys.
I have been a product management advocate my whole career. I love product management very deeply. I've held multiple product management roles. And this topic is near and dear to my heart. I've been such an advocate feeling like nobody listens until recently, which is so great. So this is a perfect time to be talking about this. I think this whole shift from a project mentality to a product mentality and treating it that way internally is a massive cultural shift, and I'm excited to talk about it. So let's start off baseline definitions. Any of my data scientists out there, we love defining terms first. So we'll start off with that. What is a data product? What is data as a product? what are we talking about here today? Because there's so many different definitions for these terms. So, Polly, let's start with you.
Sure. I take a really broad view of data as a product where, again, I think everyone deals with data daily now if you deal with the digital world at all. I do think there's a distinction between we use data in our product at all, meaning there's a database of some kind behind it, versus this emerging family of products where instead of hard-coded rules, code being the sort of logic that drives the decision-making or the predictions, there is some patterns in data that are being used to provide predictions, decisions, et cetera. So data products, I see leaning that way. Data as a product, I see as kind of distinct, and it can be both, but it's definitely where you're actually vending somewhere in the tech stack, you're vending the data for further downstream use by others. And both of those take a kind of a separate, some overlapping set of skills to really manage effectively.
Yeah, Wendy, from your Salesforce experience, would love to hear kind of your perspective on that.
Yeah, very similar to how Polly explained it. I really think about it as something that you're creating with the end user in mind that is used over and over again. So thinking about what's something that I can create that has ongoing releases, that is considering our users' needs, that we really treat as something that we're going to keep alive and evergreen and always evolving. To me, those are your products, whether you call them that or not, versus something that you may create for a one-time use or a report or something like that. Although a report, I think, can also be a product. It depends on how you use it. And I think that user experience is really a big part of what differentiates our solutions from being real products versus a one-time rinse and reuse type of experience. So it's all in how you define it and how you use it.
Yeah, and then Jen, just from your experience working with these enterprise organizations, are you seeing kind of a difference in how they're defining it internally?
Yeah, I think the way I look at it is data as a product is putting the effort in to make sure that it's fit for use, and that's treating it with product principles, right? And the difference between that and a data product is the vehicle for using and leveraging the data as a product. A great example is, a lot of people are really interested in, getting into AI and ML. You need to make sure your data is fit for use in order to be able to, have a good AI model, right? And I think a lot of companies are starting to recognize that. That's why I think this is such a hot topic and a great, conference theme, is that, putting that time and effort and those practices around making your data fit for use, which there's a lot to unpack around that, and I'm sure we will. But it really does drive business value, and you have to have a product mentality around that to really, I think, push that change in an organization that's necessary in order to get the benefit.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that because I think what's most fascinating is like the AI buzz has been useful in some ways, in some regards, to get people excited, talking about more use cases. Tons of leaders are excited. Boards of companies are like, how are we using AI? More budgets getting pushed towards it, which I think is helpful. However, I think a lot of companies are now coming to the realization that they can't do it if they don't have good data. And that is a whole foundation that they probably have been punting for a long time and not investing in.
Yep, absolutely.
And so I'd love to talk about what kinds of cultural shifts that you've all seen that have worked well. Wendy, I'd love to talk to you about that too, because at Salesforce, I know that you did a lot of work on trying to get that foundation in place. And so if you could expand on what your strategy was and process and is, that would be great.
Yeah, I think a lot of us that have kind of grown up through the data management side are sort of like, oh, this is our moment. Data catalogs are really important now. And so I do think that there's a kind of an awakening of the importance of really making sure that we have really strong data governance, that we know what the data is, where it came from. Is it of good quality? Should we be using it to train models? Should we be using it for things like AI or generative AI or not? And I think the product moment is here, and we should all grab a hold of that and take it forward. So for us, my team has been working really hard on our data strategy and making sure that it reflects the use cases around AI and that we have a really good understanding of what data we have, what it should be used for, what it should not be used for, and that we're treating it accordingly. And I think that really has never been so important as it is right now. So I think it's a great time for us to be in data.
And what does this educational process look like with these senior leaders who aren't technical, who are trying to wrap their heads around it, trying to figure out how much money to put into it, trying to figure out how to prioritize? What sorts of questions are you hearing from those individuals that need to be bought in?
I would love to interject here a little bit, because I think one thing that has been challenging, especially in enterprise organizations, is thinking about the traditional project-based funding model. And that can be tough when you think about things in strictly just revenue and cost. I think you also have to factor in things like opportunity cost and trade-offs, which is not typically part of a traditional business case necessarily, but I think it's getting to articulate that in a way that resonates with the business and have a vision of what you want to do with your data, and then start with a pretty concrete use case, some low-hanging fruit, start to build on that and show some value along the way. Especially, again, in a project-based model, so you can continue to get that buy-in by showing those wins along the way. It's a tough thing to do, especially when you have these models that are pretty entrenched, and they're not necessarily going to give you a big innovation budget to go explore. It can be a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think this is where the conversation around business value assessments come in, and how do you evaluate and measure, what is the value of this work? Like, what is the value of a data catalog? Has anyone had a good success in explaining that to a senior leader? Probably not. But to be able to explain, what could go wrong if we don't do this right, I think those conversations are more palatable in this moment. And that's where I think we have a job as data leaders to be able to explain, what does that real value look like? It's not just cost, it's not just revenue, it's also opportunity, it's risk, it's speed to market, and that's where I think we have our work cut out for us.
I think it is. There's a lot of hard discussions happening right now at a bunch of organizations, because a lot of the hype around generative AI, I've seen a lot of senior leaders discounting the fact that AI has been around for a long time, and all the stats are out about how many people are successful at it and how hard it is to operationalize. And there's something about this new wave of generative AI that has led them to believe that it's easy or cheap now, when it wasn't before, or that they don't have to have the level of data sophistication, that it's all easy. And I think that's where, really bringing in examples, right, of saying, here is literally what happens. Can we do a quick POC to disprove and give you clear examples of exactly where things are going to go wrong if we don't invest in the infrastructure we need to be able to do this properly?
And I've heard a theme amongst the conversation of quick wins, demonstrating value. What does that look like? Because I think it's one thing to say it, right? We all know, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We can show them some quick wins and show business value, but what does that realistically look like? And I'd love to talk to you, because I know you've had a lot of experience in helping people experiment with this process.
Exactly. I think new tools that allow quick building of proofs of concept or prototypes, they're now in the hands of far more people than they have been before. And there's a lot of hype around, we can just use ChatGPT and tell it to act like a database. And it kind of works, for a couple demos, right? This is not, and I'm not advocating that this is how we should start building products and that this is a path forward, but if you need to prove, hey, here's what that looks like, here's how well it works. It works 40% of the time, right? And here's kind of the effort that it takes to get that to an acceptable level. I think examples, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000,000, in really getting a lot of different stakeholders from different backgrounds on the same page about what really is possible and what is hype.
And who needs to be involved in these conversations? So we're kind of talking a little generically about senior leaders at a company, but who are these people? Who should be in the room? Who should be asking questions? Who should be in the conversation?
Honestly, I think that it is a broad conversation that needs to happen, and it does depend on your organization's size and structure. For a large enterprise, especially if you're doing something like a data mesh where you're really trying to decentralize the ownership, but that still involves centralized tools, you have just about everybody that's going to be involved in your platform is going to be a stakeholder. So, one thing is just making sure that you have the same values, that you understand what you're ultimately trying to deliver, and that will vary across different teams. And so making sure that your technology roadmap aligns with your product and business roadmap is really critical. And that involves having a lot of stakeholder conversations and making sure that you're speaking the right language, which can be tough to do, but you've got to bridge that gap. And one way to do that is sometimes I find like visuals are very, very, very helpful, especially when communicating to less technical folks. And again, just highlighting how you're going to help them get to their ultimate goal, realize their strategy and their vision.
I mean, who is not a stakeholder in this conversation, I think is the alternative of that question. And I think that every company, pretty much everyone, wants in on this topic because it's cool, right? It's as cool as data gets, is this. And so I think that you have to really think about your organization and who's going to pay for it, who's going to use it, and who's just passionate about it. Because even someone who is maybe on the periphery, but is really excited about it and understands the potential and really understands why getting the data right is so important for AI and large language models in general, those people are great to bring in as advocates. They don't have to be directly correlated to your success to be an important person in the room. Find those people, bring them in, use them to your advantage.
And I do think it is one of those product capabilities. I see the product manager as the glue. I've definitely heard the product management role likened to being a janitor, which maybe came up in the conversation this morning at the keynote. But that idea of how do you get the set of stakeholders together and translate, I think that's something that's, regardless of AI and data competence, it's not happening enough in organizations anyway, right? Where you have someone there who can adeptly translate between the different stakeholders and keep them on the same page. So that just became way more critical.
Yeah, and I love talking about all the technical nuances as much as the next person. But as you can see, these are really people challenges.
Yes.
We're talking about a cultural shift of a company, and that's where we start running into those roadblocks. Who owns it? Who follows up on it? What sort of change needs to happen? And I think that's one of the biggest problems most companies are facing today. How do you coordinate across all of these different groups inside of an organization? I mean, some of these companies are massive, and they have so many data engineers and data stewards and operational stakeholders, and all of them are rarely in the room together, and they're rarely having the right conversation to try to make data quality improvements, build the right products. So I want to talk a little bit about the amount of waste that we're seeing in organizations today and inefficiencies of this whole process that we have continually reinforced. This like, hey, I'm interested in this, piece of data, go query that, give me a report, and then that's the end of it. How do we change the way that these data products are built and reduce that waste and inefficiency inside of these organizations?
I think there's a lot to be said for the data officer and how that role is evolving. I think a lot of companies, and I can speak to just my own experience at Salesforce, but also several of our customers that I have the opportunity to meet with, it is falling on the CDO's shoulders, I think, in many cases. And the hard part is, there is this velocity behind this topic that is really hard to contain. And so I think that communication is probably more important than delivery in this moment, because everyone is scattering and running and trying to figure out how they're going to bring this to life in their own teams. And there's pressure to do this because it is in the boardroom, because it is at the executive level. And so everyone is kind of panicked, right? And so it's our job, I think, in the data organizations to really bring everyone together, kind of get everybody calmed down a little bit and talk about what are we really doing? What are we trying to achieve? How do we use our resources prudently and diligently and really get focus out of it so we can get these rinse and reuse solutions, which is why I think the product conversation is so critical in this moment, because otherwise we're all going to get 100 footballs one yard down the field instead of actually getting a touchdown.
Yeah, and to that point, actually, we were talking a little bit about this. I think the incentive structures have been pretty inefficient inside of these organizations. For one example, publish this many dashboards by the end of the year. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. How do we set goals that actually drive us towards value and not quantity? I'm curious to hear if you've seen something work in that regard.
I'm a big advocate of both bringing executives, 10% deeper towards the technical metrics that we like to use. Not all the way. I know a lot of data scientists would just love them to understand like blue scores and stuff. I'm like, not that far. But the other thing is really learning to communicate in those value-centered metrics that business leaders use. Because I think it's that lack of translation that they're trying to bridge. And if they're not great at it, they're like, we just want, okay, we'll set something concrete. We know we need concrete numbers, so we'll use quantity. As opposed to saying, hey, let's spend some time figuring out how the number of dashboards aligns with revenue or user growth, or like, can we really actually do the work to understand how this is driving value? That does take some time and research. You do have to invest in that in many cases.
And that's the hard part.
Uh-huh.
And nobody wants to do that work.
No.
I would agree. I would advocate so much for just, I know it's extra time. Sometimes folks balk when they hear we need to do discovery. They think of it as a big black box, and you're going to go run away for who knows how long, and we don't know what you're doing when product people say do discovery. But there are ways where you can make that really valuable and reflect that back. If you're asking for folks' time, make sure that you're bringing them back into the conversation. You should have regular cadences with your stakeholders regardless. But, take the time to really understand what their challenges are, what their goals are, what their pain points are, and then reflect that back to them and show them how taking a different, more product-centered approach can actually help them reach their goals, and that you're partnering with them for that. And you're not building for the sake of building, because there's no value in that. And when you show that, you're on a journey to help them realize their value, and then again, I do always advocate for having a big vision, but still finding that low-hanging fruit and showing those wins along the way, because I do think that's how you get buy-in that you need in order to maintain that good momentum towards a good end result.
Yeah, and I think what's also very challenging, I always think of the iceberg picture when you're talking about value for this type of initiative, because, if you really listed out all the dependencies that it would take to get something fun and fancy across the finish line, you would bore everyone to death probably in those rooms. And so I think the technical complexity is what is the big challenge that we have a hard time typically communicating towards stakeholders. Well, we need to invest all of this money in, cloud, and in completely redesigning our data engineering platform, and getting a catalog and putting lineage in place. It's hard to tie these types of foundational initiatives to ROI generating projects. And so I'd love to hear from each of you on some of the technical complexity that you've run into that has prevented or halted or created friction on demonstrating value very quickly. Like, you mentioned the data mesh transformation. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the aims of a data mesh is really to decentralize data ownership back to the data teams, right? But you're doing that through shared infrastructure, and that can be expensive, and that is a big change. And to an earlier point you mentioned, it is like it's a socio-technical approach. It's not a technical implementation. It's not an architectural approach. It's really more about people and process than it is about technology if you want to succeed. And I think it can be very difficult to explain not only the technical changes that are necessary, but also get people thinking in a different way while you're doing that. And again, I think that goes back to how you have to just communicate. It's so important to really, again, attach to the value that it's going to deliver to the business. An example that I can give, how we got across some of those technical hurdles where it's like, oh my gosh, this is going to be so expensive, and they look at IT as a cost center. But when you have all of this valuable data in an enterprise, and you don't know how you can leverage it, and maybe you're in a sensitive industry, you tend to err on the side of just not letting anybody use the data unless they absolutely have to. Well, your data usage agreement may actually allow for broader sharing. And by investing in that technology and building out that infrastructure, you are actually going to knock down a lot of silos, allow more people to access data, and do it in a safe and compliant way, and have all of that auditability there. And I think showing the art of the possible there is how you can navigate some of those more technical challenges, especially around funding. The tech's possible. I think there are other challenges that are more of a hurdle than technical. I mean, there's a myriad of ways to achieve it technically. It's people and process, I think, that's very challenging.
I had a similar experience at a previous employer where we were trying to standardize on like 9 metrics at the very top of the organization. And I remember distinctly the CEO saying to me, like, go off and figure this out for us, but please don't take forever. Direct quote. Okay, I'm like, well, okay, well, it depends what we find, you know. So
Forever's a long time.
Yeah, forever.
Long.
Like, what does that mean exactly? Is that 9 months? Is it 9 years? But we went out and kind of got a state of the union on these 9 metrics. We found that, like, from the beginning, inconsistent definitions, inconsistent calculations, inconsistent sourcing. You know, some of the data didn't exist, and so we had to go back to him and say, like, this is why this is going to take us some time to fix, because we actually have to go change some of our products to create and generate the data in use so that we can make the calculation, so that we can produce this metric that you've decided that you want. And so just getting that alignment and showing, you know, enough transparency to someone at that level to understand why it takes so long, what the investment really is, and why, it also helped us to ensure that that metric really mattered. Are we willing to invest to really get this measure correct for our C-suite and for our board and for our stockholders ultimately? And the answer was yes. But what we did is we tried to deliver like imperfect results with what we had along the way, so they could see, like, yes, we have this data, it maybe doesn't have the drill down yet, but here's the current state. And then as we were able to deliver those iterative pieces, we turned on those parts of our metrics as a service solution so that we could show them that we were making progress. And that helped us to get both buy-in that we were doing the right thing, but also to demonstrate, like, this is hard. Like, this is really, really hard work, and it requires us to change how we operate. It requires us to make changes to how our products run, and those are not easy to do. It's complicated, and that visibility really helped us to get buy-in from the very top of the organization as to why this is so hard in the first place.
And it's so hard to balance that agility, to give that transparency. I've always found that to kind of maintain that startup like excitement of a new project, you do need people who are rushing ahead and saying, like, let's just look at the data, a small set. Does this even work? Are we collecting the right data? There's those initial POCs, and you need sort of team A going fast and proving out, like, are we even on the right path for this working well? But then you also need the team B that's going to actually set this up to work at scale. And really explaining early to your stakeholders that team A's results are not like, great, turn on the taps now. That you have to explain that early, that this is like paving the way with a very narrow path that will someday be a highway.
And one of the major challenges I see in this whole song and dance is this bottom-up versus top-down, like, approach. So a lot of organizations that I've observed will say, well, what data do we have? What can we do? What's feasible today? What are the data sets that have good quality that we can build value on top of? And then you get into this trap where now your business stakeholders are like, well, you give us ideas. You know the data.
Right.
You tell us what we need to know. And that's really hard to do, and I've seen a lot of teams try. And then you've got the top-down approach where you've got someone who's super savvy and like gets it, and it's so fun to work with them because they have a vision for what they want, and you can help them achieve that. How do we facilitate these types of conversations where there's enough input to show the art of the possible for the stakeholders, but there's still a strategic objective driving these conversations? What have you all seen work? What's the balance? If you have a magical way of doing this, I'm sure everyone wants to know.
I have one word. It's why. You ask your CEO or your top executive, why do they need that? What is the thing that they're trying to do that they can't do today? Why? And also for your teams, like, they have ideas. Okay, well, why do you think that? And it really challenged you to come into this middle ground where those two worlds unite, to be able to understand the real reason they're doing it. Like, so what? Like, what are you trying to do? Why does that matter? Why do you think that approach works? You know, Mr. or Mrs. CEO, why is it that that's going to give you the answer that you need? And that, I think, helps unlock a lot of the noise from the system and really get everybody focused and aligned. It's really digging into that, the why.
I think there's a partnership that it's like a handshake that in a lot of orgs is kind of just barely being missed. I think we've had an industry that has been tech-led because a lot of organizations are running that way, tech-led initiatives. But I also feel like the product folks who aren't technical haven't necessarily really been empowered to really lead those conversations because they don't have the depth to be able to understand what's possible with the data. So some organizations are trying to train up the product side with more technical capabilities. Some organizations are asking data science leaders to do more and more of the product part, right? And I've definitely found that courses I develop for product managers, I'm shocked at the number of data science leaders coming to me saying, yeah, I'm a director of data science, but all the PMs are going to report to me. What do they do? What do I need to know to lead and mentor and grow product skills in my team? So I think it's that kind of merging, overlapping, that whether people are empowered through learning and improving product skills in a data science role, if that's their passion, or finding that product partner who can be upskilled to really get what's possible with the data, that's kind of the gap that I think needs to be closed quickly for organizations to really master that aspect.
Yeah, I've been hearing companies debate about this like culturally for a long time. I can't tell you how many companies that I've walked into where they expect all their data scientists to be product managers.
Yeah.
That is a whole other role.
Yeah.
Somebody's got a PhD in stats and you're telling them that they should know all of the product concepts. And that's just not the case. Some of them are great and they know and they pick up on it very quickly. But to your point, like, that's not their job.
Right.
And they're so expensive, so we'll just give them 2 roles, right? And they have to show value, but their job is to build and obviously work and empathize with the data that they're working with or the problem they're trying to solve, but they need assistance to manage that. And I think that's been a huge miss.
Yeah.
There's just no one responsible and accountable for that.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting too, like if you see the subtitle of the theme, it's an empathetic approach. And so how do we drive more empathy in this process? I mean, we've talked for years and years and years on this stage about ethical frameworks to weave into the process. It starts with design and it starts with product management. How do we facilitate more cultural conversations about designing empathetically? What have you seen work? Who owns that? Who sits at the table to have those conversations?
I'm going to kind of harken back to something Polly said, which I think is really important and something that I've seen work in varying degrees of success depending on kind of the organization's culture. When product managers have more autonomy and there's more flexibility within the organization to bring folks in the data science team, the analytics team, and bring them into the product development process, you're more successful. And you can rely on their expertise, they can rely on your expertise, and you can truly partner together to do more. And thinking about, the empathetic and ethical considerations of product management, which I believe very strongly in. If anybody's seen like the social, what was that, the Social Network movie? There's a lot of considerations. We're basically trying to optimize as much usage and adoption as possible, typically, and that can come at the expense of ethics at times. And there are pitfalls that can be caught in the design of data solutions that an experienced data scientist or a data engineer or data analyst can help navigate. And it's only through that partnering that you're going to really get the best possible solution. And some organizations foster that and encourage that, but others are like, well, you're an expensive resource. We don't want you spending time in meetings or doing discovery with product. You need to build. And ultimately, that doesn't lead to the best results. It's worth the investment.
One of the anti-patterns that I see arising of doing this wrong, and I've seen it in a lot of organizations, especially if they have really strong science or tech teams that have come out of academia, we hire the best PhDs, is that they want to work on kind of abstract, generalized problems. It then comes down the pike to like, oh, we've made a product out of it. And then often it's a product manager who get asked at the end, like, oh, right, can you like responsibilify this? Can you like sprinkle ethics somewhere on it? As opposed to starting with that from the beginning. And getting back to your point on churn, right? I think that's where a lot of organizations see this churn of going back and going, oh, we're not actually allowed to use that data, or here are all the reasons and considerations we should have thought through before we got to this point. There has to be an agile way to be able to keep that moving, but it does involve more stakeholders from the beginning.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of organizations having that conversation today, where we've been talking about data privacy and data ethics, and even in regulated industries, they have pretty rigorous structure to ensure that they're not in violation, or at least they try. And they have, these mechanisms to audit a lot of that. But now we're starting to see the conversations about AI ethics, and are we just lumping it into all of our data conversations? Are they separate? Why are they separate? Are they together? Do you all have thoughts on that conversation? Because it's typically split, in my opinion, or like in my observations. I'm not saying that's the right way or wrong way, but that's what's been happening. So I'm curious to hear from all of you on, should they be split? How should organizations be thinking about that and putting structure in place to support it?
Well, I think it comes down to your company's values too. Like at Salesforce, at least, we have a core set of values that we really do apply to everything we do, and the first one is trust. So every decision that's made, is this going to increase or decrease trust with our customers, with our employees, with our various stakeholders? And so when it comes to applying, new releases or AI, and in this case, to our products, that first goes through that lens of trust. We actually have a separate team from the data organization called the Ethical and Humane Use of Technology. And their job is to make sure that the product is built with ethics in mind, that people cannot use the product to do things that would not align with our corporate values. And I think that they've done a tremendous job making sure that, like, if you're going to build, say, a model into the product that may lead you to have a biased action against a customer, it flags that for you. Hey, this may create a problem. Are you sure? And it's that intentional friction in the process that helps ensure that we're providing a product to our customers that doesn't help, in turn, hurt their customers. Even though we don't have any access to that data, it still ensures that that product is built with ethics and trust in mind. And I think that intentionality is really important, whether it's building software or whether it's building, a new, AI model or whatever the case is, that you really think about, what am I trying to achieve ultimately? Not just in this one solution, but is that to build a trustworthy product? Is it to build something that's quick? There might be different objectives in different scenarios, but really thinking about that, really listening to the stakeholder and internalizing that first, I think is a really important step that we often rush past.
Is it, enough to have an oversight committee, or do we have to be more intentional about stopping people along the way? And how do we do that? Because it's so nice to talk about it, and I think we all get it conceptually, but the problem is operationalizing that.
Right.
So are we, how have you seen organizations do that? Because again, if everybody's bought in and everybody says they're going to do it, that's great. But that doesn't always happen. People have deadlines, they're thinking about their career moves, people are complicated. So how do we operationalize a lot of this?
I think it goes back to something you said earlier, Reagan, about making sure your incentives are right and that they're aligned. People are going to do what they're incentivized and rewarded for. And if that's part, Wendy, she just said that it's part of Salesforce's fabric. And so I'm assuming that that behavior is rewarded and incentivized. Yep. And there are other organizations where they're only going to do the bare minimum based on regulations because they don't want to get a fine. And that's reality. And that's just something I think that people have to be aware of. I think it is, you have to be intentional. And it has to be a part of if you think about things in old school term, stage gates, it should be part of every one. And it can't just be passed down to a board to review at the end of the line, because especially with something like an AI or ML model, by that point it could be too late. So.
One of the most concrete frameworks I really like, it comes from Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, an oldie but a goodie. But she had advocated for, early on in the project, do a stakeholder impact assessment that really is like a 360-degree view. So not just your users and potential groups that you want to protect against bias, ethical considerations, but the people whose data you're collecting. Like, how would, if this goes well and you win, how does that impact them, right? All of the data annotators, how are they being impacted by this? The engineers on your team, the climate, society at large. And I find it's a nice way that's actually quite agile. I think a lot of people fall into the trap of thinking, oh, if we want to do this ethically, we have to spend months and months of writing 40, 80-page documents to prove we're ethical, and do we want to invest in that? But in a quick, one-day seminar, you can really get a lot of the team together from different viewpoints to elicit, who are these people, how could this play out? And let's at least note that we've thought of this and put this in a risk register that we revisit, and we have a risk assessment policy throughout the life cycle where we're saying, which are the biggest risks, right? So if a company like OpenAI had been looking at, hey, we're crawling the open web and stealing images, how will this impact the big image providers out there? At least flagging that as a consideration to decide if you want to do something about it, rather than having it surprise you at the end, can really help you save time along the way.
And you mentioned framework, which I think is great. Are there other frameworks or policies or processes that you've run into that you find to be very effective, or methodologies? Like design thinking, I hear get brought up a lot in terms of creating products for the end user. What sorts of processes do you guys follow?
Yeah, design thinking is a great one. I'm a big fan of, doing a lot of different discovery tactics, like opportunity mapping, to make sure that you're understanding all the implications and that you're getting to something valuable. That's a really helpful framework for that. From a data perspective, again, I think it really does come to, even if you're starting with something as simple as a lean canvas, it can be that simple, just but articulating everything that you're trying to, achieve and how you're going to achieve it, who's involved, what are the different aspects that you have to consider. It doesn't have to be as in-depth as a super, detailed project plan or anything, but just to lay out the pieces and parts and see it on one page. And the other benefit of that is that oftentimes when you're starting a big initiative or trying to align on something, people have varying perceptions on what that means. And when you put it all down and socialize that and talk about it, it's a very easy and quick way to get on the same page earlier rather than later.
I think just really thinking through what could go wrong is a simple oldie but goodie approach where you can really think about, what is the worst case scenario? Who are the stakeholders we're not thinking about that may actually be implicated by this? And just spending some time holding space for that in some of your project discussions up front can be really helpful. And then coming back to it at each release. Okay, now that we've made this progress, is there anything we missed? Is there any new group that maybe has come into the fold since our last assessment? Do we need to talk to them? Is there other people we need to spend time listening to? Who else might end up using this? And just continuing to revisit that conversation, I think, is just a really good step. You don't even need a lot of tech for that. You can put that in, a spreadsheet or on a PowerPoint slide or something, but just really keeping that live, I think, is important.
Yeah, and I want to talk about, I know we're talking a lot about the cultural side of this too. I want to give everybody listening in some kind of tactical steps they can take in their organization. This term has been brought up a lot, but data literacy is kind of a big term that people, sorry if that was triggering, that people are pushing at their organizations. I think the intent is good and pure, but they have these full programs that they are trying to get everyone basically educated and their heads wrapped around some of these core concepts to make that cultural shift. Have you seen that work? What are your opinions of programs like that? What should they include? And then how do you kind of pitch this type of program to an organization to kick off that cultural change?
I think one of the pitfalls of data literacy is that they are often driven kind of from frustrated data teams who are like, I told them we had 98% accuracy and they didn't care. It's driving me crazy, right? That they really wish that business cared more or understood more about why certain things matter. And that's not coming from a bad place. But I think what might be even more valuable is actually getting everyone on the same page and talking in the same terms and metrics about how we agree we deliver value to our customers. Right? And whether that's through KPIs, I'm a big fan, and because I've been trained in it, of sort of the Amazon working backwards process, where you're really starting by articulating, like, here's what our users will say when this is launched, and let's make a really concrete vision, qualitatively and quantitatively, of the wins that this will deliver, that you can put in front of, a non-technical set of stakeholders, and we all agree that those are the kinds of value that we want to provide.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the term data literacy. Did you see me cringe when you brought it up? I often find that it's a little triggering for executives when you sit them down and you're like, okay, now we're going to talk about data literacy. And they kind of react like, I don't need you to tell me how to read a spreadsheet. Like, they have this kind of like negative reaction to it. And so I think what we're really looking for is better data engagement. And that happens in every conversation, every day. But if you sit some people down and say, okay, I'm going to put you through this data literacy webinar or process or this program, or I need you to go do these things, they often do not like being told that they need to be trained. And so I think you have to find more clever ways to drive that data education in more of a natural and organic way. Otherwise, you risk kind of getting your executive team to think like, oh, here comes the data literacy person again, And so I think we want them to really understand the value that we're deriving and understand what the art of possible is. And if you're using that time that you have with them to talk about literacy, I think you lose some of your credibility. And so just really focusing your time on what can go right, what can we do with this data, what can we do from a value generation perspective is a much more valuable use of that time. Yes, we need to do data literacy activities and we do need the collective sum of the organization to be educated, but I would not talk about that at the executive level because I think it steers the conversation in a direction that has a more of a sour taste than if you can really focus on what can go right and the good. That tends to be where you get more excitement and engagement and whatnot. So I would not lead with that.
And I think it goes both ways too. I think that one of the learnings that I found with a client engagement, trying to understand why certain initiatives around data discoverability and understanding had not gone as well as they'd hoped in the past, was that getting the necessary business context documented appropriately. There was a high barrier for a lot of the tooling. It was made for like data scientists, data analysts, and that was preventing to get that great business logic understanding associated to the data so that it could be more discoverable and understandable and therefore usable. And so understanding that, that if you want to involve the folks that are not part of the data team but are users, stakeholders, they have a lot of really important context. They may not be the most tech savvy folks. Then, you have to lower the barrier and make sure that those tooling it counts for them as a persona as well and is accessible to them. Bring them into the conversation, have them, give them the ability to put their great context and learning into it and make it, a two-way conversation. I think that can be helpful too.
Yeah, this goes back to the question why. I think what's in it for me is always the biggest question that these end users have of not just dashboards or models, but tools like a data catalog. You've got sometimes non-technical individuals who are very, very well versed in a very specific operation in the company and can provide tons of context and value and can be supported by these data products. But I think that shift isn't clear and there's a trust issue. Is this thing going to replace me? Why should I tell you all of the things that I've learned over the last 10 years? Are you going to automate parts of my job? I think people are having very real thoughts about that they will never say out loud, but that's how they feel. And I think this is an opportunity for a lot of data teams to think through that. I'm just curious if any of you have had conversations like that with leaders lately. I know I have had a couple, because it's a very real conversation, especially with the productivity gains that AI can bring. How do we get people to give us information to build good products to support them, and how do we communicate that? Because I feel like now more than ever, this has been a challenge. What sorts of conversations are you guys having?
Yeah, I think it's a good time to have these conversations, maybe more so than before, because we're all in this economic situation where we're not hiring as much. People are being asked to do more with less resources. And so the idea of being able to provide a location to go get your data or that's already fit for use that they can go engage with easier is a more open conversation than it was maybe a year or two ago. And so I'm finding that people are more willing to share information. They're more willing to engage in like a cataloging effort because that will make their job easier, and they need that. They need some pressure release right now so that they have capacity to do new and innovative things, and they don't have any more hours in the day than any of us do. And so I think there's a more of a willingness to engage in those types of conversations than they have been previously.
Yeah, I think I've seen massive democratization efforts happen, which means we're trying to get people who are the bottleneck, more capacity, more free time to do more with what they know. And it is, I think, a huge barrier to cross. I don't think we should just be saying, here's where you find data. We should be having these types of conversations with everyone at the organization who participates in some sort of data capture process, curation, quality assessment. This is the opportunity. So if a program that any of you are leading around data literacy doesn't include that, I think that's a big miss as well. And I know we're getting up on time, so some departing thoughts. If you were to give kind of like one, piece of advice to people listening in, even my virtual people, hello. If you were to give a departing piece of advice, what would it be?
I think collaboration has instantly become so much more important right at the time that people are kind of spiking their fear around their job security, whether it's through generative AI efficiency advances or just through the economy today, right? So there's a challenge to us as leaders to overtly encourage that collaboration, and empathy really is that key to get to earn the trust that's necessary and build the trust between teams. More and more we're seeing that technology isn't going to be the moat, the thing that distinguishes your company. It's going to be a combination of your product implementation or the data that you've built up. And so these teams that haven't been as connected or as collaborative as they need to be, that's going to be the essential skill that's going to carry you forward through the next couple of years.
I would say just remember that you are a business leader first and a data professional second, and that the biggest value that you can provide your company is to be that translator. So the more that you can speak in like plain terms about what your value is, why it matters to the business, and being able to translate to where they are coming from, the more successful you're going to be. If you spend time using data jargon or trying to explain things in too technical of a way, you're actually putting more space between you and your stakeholder. And so the further you can go towards them, I think the more success you'll have as a data professional. And that's where I think the most successful data professionals are really rising up through their organizations, because they've proven that they can do the technical work, but also explain it in a way that makes a lot of common sense. And I've found that to be true in every industry.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that and say just anchor to a why. And if you're not sure why you're doing something, don't be afraid to ask. There should be a strategy. When there is a strategy, you're going to be much more successful. And don't be afraid to ask those questions. And the more you have a broader understanding of the end game, the better you're going to be equipped to do your job. And yes, I would also echo collaboration is absolutely critical.
Amazing. Well, hopefully you all enjoyed this conversation. I definitely did. I could keep going. But would everyone join me in a round of applause for our panelists here? Amazing. Thank you all for being here. Great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks so much for coming.